And holy smokes, you guys are in for a treat tonight. This is one of my favorite guests on the show, Paul Belz. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
Paul has written a number of books. He is a science and nature educator locally, and I'm maybe abroad, I'm not sure, but I definitely know locally.
California.
California.
Bay Area, primarily.
Bay Area, California. He's written a few other books, and I believe we've had him on for at least 2 other books, I think.
Well, one other book. It's
one for sure.
A poetry collection. Sometimes the Soul Needs Chocolate.
That one was awesome. And I asked him earlier, I was like, Ode to Chocolate? Well, Ode to Chocolate is one of the names of the pieces in there, I think.
It is.
And so that's what I was thinking of that. That one was a beautiful book, and I encourage you to get it. But before we dive in, the name of this book that we're going to be talking about tonight is Bidwell Park, Personal Reflections and Casual Conversations about Chico's Crown Jewel. So I will disclaim first, if you like what you're about to hear or would like to be part of the show, you can email me at write.onair@gmail.com, write.onair@gmail.com. And before we begin, just so you guys know, where can we find this book, Paul?
You can find it at the bookstore, at Made in Chico, at Bidwell Supplies, and at Hidden Treasures.
Perfect.
Oh, and I think the Chico History Museum also has a couple copies.
Ooh, I would hope so. Man, that's the place for it.
Yeah.
Cool. And then I know we talked a bit beforehand. There was another event that's coming up you wanted to mention?
Tomorrow night at 7, I'm going to be at Museum of Northern California Art. And I was asked to do a presentation about this Bidwell Park book. But they have an exhibit that was done along with the Snow Goose Festival. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit on the birds of Bidwell Park, but I'll be going over some of the things that I'll be talking about here tonight, too.
And as you'll find, that's the right spot for Paul to be, I think, for this book. There's a lot of discussion. I'm hesitant I don't want to jump off on the start of this. I kind of want Paul to start this. He's got a little bit better of an understanding of the book that he just wrote. Paul, where would you like to start off with this?
Where would I like to start off? I will say a couple of things. I was asked to write this book, about 6 or 7 years ago, because the person who asked me felt that the park was not getting enough attention and coverage, and it's getting less now. That's a story in itself. So I was asked to write this. I thought I could do it in a year. I told people that, and one of them told me several years later, I thought you were crazy. But this book is dedicated to Wes Dempsey, who a lot of people know of. He was a well-loved biologist connected with the university. Passed almost 2 years ago now. He was 95. But he gave me a lot of information and a lot of inspiration and support for doing this.
And again, this is a writing show. We aren't going to be taking any direct expert excerpts from this book because there's so much. So what we've kind of done for tonight's show, and by the way, this will be a 2-parter because this book is quite in-depth and has a lot to discuss. And there's kind of 2 distinct portions of the book that we decided to separate in. This first portion is going to be a little bit more about the events that help structure the park, I would say. Some of the natural history, who was here first potentially, leading into John and Annie, and then kind of some major events that we felt were worth talking about. Mm-hmm. Granted, all of them are worth talking about. It's why there's a book written on this right now. So we are glossing over what Paul has gone pretty in-depth on, and could have even gone in more in-depth, I think.
Yeah.
So I think we wanted to start on natural history for this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, we could sit here and talk about this all night. The geomorphology of the park, there are basically 3 types. There are more than the 3 types of formations that I'll mention, but these are the ones that are mentioned the most often. There's the Chico Formation. At one time, there was an inland sea here, and it deposited sandstone and mud and shale. That's the bedrock of the park and of Chico too, for that matter. Then there were volcanic eruptions in the Cascades roughly 10 million years ago, a series of eruptions where we get the Lovejoy basalt. You can see a lot of those formations. A lot of that is in Upper Park around places like Bear Hole and farther up. And you can also see Lovejoy basalt at places like Table Mountain and Black Butte Lake. And the formation you see the most is called the Tuscan Formation, which was a series of mud flows. Snow melted on volcanoes, carried mud down, and a lot of the park, a lot of what you see is that formation, including Monkey Face. Monkey face is part of the formation.
And his book describes it as the park. I don't know if it was you describing it or someone else. My memory is not is failing me at this point. But it's described as a cake.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of like it's this giant layered over lots of geologic time system, and we get the fortunate event of having a river that cut through the whole thing, and so we can kind of look at the whole wall all the way down, which I think is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, Big Chico Creek coming down from Colby Mountain and flowing out to the Sacramento.
Yeah, so cool.
Oh yeah.
I wish I had another show on the geology of things, because that was my first love, was trying to get into geology. So I will save my questions so we can continue. What would be the next part that we dive into on this?
Plant communities. There are a lot of plant communities in the park. Up on the Tuscan formations, those areas tend to be less wet, so you get a lot of very drought adapted plants there, including the blue oaks, which are very drought adapted. And one of the other main ecosystems is right by the creek itself, the riparian system. And there you have the valley oaks, which are much more water dependent, but they grow to a taller size. They have tap roots that dig deep into the earth. Tons of wildflowers. Right now we're starting to see all kinds of wildflowers blooming. And we have tons of birds. Acorn woodpeckers, Wes Dempsey told me, are the most common animal in the park.
Wow.
And tons of other birds, which I will be talking about in more depth tomorrow at Monca.
At Monca, please.
At Monca, thank you.
I think, I will try to make that, so we might be there as well. But Monca, 7 o'clock tomorrow, for those of you who don't know. Paul will be there. If you bring a book, I'm sure he'd be willing to sign it.
Oh, they'll be selling them there.
Okay, great. Well, then definitely make sure, if you get one there, to have Paul sign it, because he has a fantastic autograph.
And tons of wildlife, lots of animals, everything from squirrels to butterflies, bears and mountain lions will come trouncing through from time to time. And we could talk about this all night, but let's just say it's a really ecologically rich place.
Yes. So we've had a little bit of the natural history, a little bit of the species that were there. Paul, you wanted to touch on the peoples who were also first there? Yeah,
the Mechoopda Maidu. The Maidu were a large group of people who lived all over this region. And the Mechoopda specifically were the Maidu who lived around Chico. And of course they're still here. And a number of them are doing things like traditional ecological knowledge and really promoting traditional knowledge about our region. But they lived very close to the land. They relied very much on the resources that were there. And we do have a detailed appendix that will give you a whole lot more information about their history and culture.
Yeah, and again, this intro that you've heard so far wasn't the focus of all of Paul's book. There was a lot more to it, but the way we're structuring this discussion, because it's going to be a two-part show, is kind of we're detailing a large swath of time that has gone through, so we can kind of get up to the speed of where we're currently at. So thank you for the Mechoopda people for continuing their stewardship of the land. And then I think that leaps into John and Annie.
John and Annie. We could talk all night about John and Annie.
Yeah.
On a lot of different levels and with a lot of different perspectives. But John owned a huge amount of land around here. He raised a lot of money through gold mining and bought a lot of land in this area and did a lot of experiments with agriculture. His idea was that agriculture would turn California into a Garden of Eden. And go ahead.
Oh, I was just taking a big breath because that went some different directions than maybe he was anticipating. But continue.
Okay, but he and his wife Annie both did have a close relationship with the land. They were friends of John Muir's, actually.
Yeah.
And they had decided at one point that they would preserve a large part of their ranch and ultimately donate it to the city of Chico. Yeah. As open space that people could use. They called it Vallombrosa. It's named after a place that's mentioned in Paradise Lost. So John did die in 1900, and Annie, a lot of people don't know, they were in debt for a while. But Annie managed to sell off property and pay off the debts. And in 1905, she did come up with a deed where she donated a large part of the land to the city, largely areas up around Upper Park, a lot of it, and also some around places like the Hooker Oak, which I mentioned.
Yeah.
There have been additions to the park since then.
Yeah, some of the additions were farmers who decided to have land, had a bunch of land and went, I'm not using this. This would be better. It's right next to the park, so they kind of just glommed it on.
Yeah.
So it was an initial donation from Annie, and I believe in that deed, and you mentioned in the book, she specified that this was going to be for the people, for the city, for Chico. And was there some preservation or conservation mentioned in any of that?
Oh, absolutely. She said she made two statements, and these... Some people say she had attitudes that were a little different. She did say it was for all the people of Chico to enjoy, but she also stated very clearly that she wanted the creek and the wildlands and the plants and animals to be protected.
Yeah.
And she was very adamant about both of those points.
Extremely clearly.
Yeah. Which was really interesting because some people say, Annie wanted to give the park to everybody to use as they chose, and others say no, Annie gave it to us as a nature preserve. So some of the controversies have been based on those two perspectives.
So now we'll hit the jumping off point. And correct me, she donated the park. Was it on her death in a deed, or was it just prior?
Oh, no, she... donated it in 1905.
1905, okay.
She lived until 1918.
Okay. Well, when she passed, at least as the book, if I'm remembering correctly, that is when things became, I don't want to say contentious, but maybe chaotic would be a good word for it, because suddenly it went from, we can ask Annie directly what she meant, and she'll explain it, to now we can't ask her, and so we get to interpret.
Yeah, well, things were not as chaotic at first. A body was created called the Bidwell Park and Playground Commission, which still exists, and it manages, it acts as an advisory body to City Council. And they make a lot of proposals, not only about Bidwell Park, but about all the other open spaces in town. And again, an advisory body primarily. That there have been different disagreements about that. At first, it seemed like the idea that the park existed for human use was the primary idea. This did change, of course, around the 70s and 80s when people started emphasizing the idea of preserving the place more.
Yeah, thank goodness it started to steer that direction. So I have in my notes here some of the events we wanted to talk about, some of the park and playground events, and I think we might have missed that the Mechoopda had wanted to make a park in there. Did we skip over that?
Yeah. Oh, there was a proposal a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. There was going to be a model Mechoopda village in what used to be the old deer pens. That's another story.
Yeah.
And there was going to be a village and an educational program, but they did not get a grant. I think it would be great for everybody if this could happen at some time in the future. Yeah,
talk about a educational learning center that we could continue teaching people into our future about. Mm-hmm. That would be a big hub, in my opinion. But I mentioned that because I didn't want to forget that we had to plan to talk about that a little bit. So up until after Annie's death, you said things were a little bit quiet. And then one of the events that kind of started to really spark some major stuff was Highway 99.
Highway 99. This was really pretty wild. 1950s. It was a disagreement. People decided that there needed to be a highway going through Chico because the area was growing so rapidly. The state wanted it to be parallel to Sheridan Avenue, pretty much purely for engineering reasons. A lot of the city, including Mayor Ted Merriam, wanted it to be out by Forest Avenue, which, believe it or not, was the one sort of close out to the eastern boundaries of the town in those days. Hard to believe, but true. It was a big fight. People felt that it should be Forest Avenue because if it was Sheridan, it would split the city in half and also cut right through 1 mile recreation area. And there were other issues, so went on for years and years in the 1950s of all time.
Yeah.
And finally, Sheridan Avenue obviously did win out.
Yeah. And I think we had mentioned a little bit of discussion about there were so many things going on in the park, like even speed limits of how fast people should drive through the park at that point.
Oh, yeah. This was a little bit later, the 1970s and 80s, and beyond that. South Park Drive and North Park Drive were places, particularly South Park, were places where people would have road races. Yeah. And Wes Dempsey told me that he could have shown me trees, oaks, where cars had crashed into them. And it was a big party scene. So there were attempts to limit traffic, to impose speed limits. People wanted to limit the traffic to a big extent. It became a controversy because at a certain point, a lot of people with disabilities said that our only access to the park is through cars.
Yeah, which drove a lot of discussion on, well, how should we develop the land that we have here as a park? Mm-hmm. Should it be accessible at this point?
Yeah.
And as you see in Lower Bidwell, yes, that's kind of where that discussion ended. We now have some roads through the lower portion of the park so people can access a good portion of 1 mile at this point. Continue, yeah.
And as you go farther up into the park, there are picnic areas that are pretty close to the street, so it's not that difficult for a lot of people with disabilities or families to get to these picnic areas. Yeah. But I'm sure we're going to hear more about this issue in the future. It was a very big, contentious thing at one time.
Yeah, and I don't want to say the park is just a series of things people cared about, but in some ways it was a lot of who was most vocal and continued a thought or idea on what they wanted to have done in the park.
Yeah.
Is that kind of a correct assumption for that?
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah.
Wes Dempsey told me that everybody in town wanted a piece of the park.
Yeah, that seems correct. The portion that's coming to my mind in the book is when Annie Bidwell died, and everyone was like, wait a minute, what are we going to do with it? And then there was a lot of discussion for a second, and then I would say that discussion has continued on into now.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Hasn't really been stopped. The most shocking part of this book for me when I was reading it was that the military had a hand in the park. Mm-hmm. Literally. Can you explain that a little bit?
There were training sessions in Upper Park. It was ROTC and other military organizations.
Yeah.
And they would do training, and it became, for a while, a long time it was accepted. Around the 1980s, when a lot of people were very worked up about U.S. policy toward Central America, the question rose, do we really want there to be military trainings in the park?
Yeah.
So that went on and on for a while. The interesting thing is, should I say how it ended?
Yeah, please.
This I find really interesting. Right after the Gulf War, the original Gulf War, the military was very possible, but California State University decided that they did not want to continue a relationship with ROTC because they felt it discriminated against gay people. So that ended, and the military training in the park ended around the same time.
Which is mentioned in the book, by the way. So if you want more of that, you'll get the full story there. The other one was I have ORVs and hills. Can you explain that one a little bit?
People used to drive ORVs and motorcycles up into the hills near Horseshoe Lake, up in that part of the park, which was really crazy because you have a lot of very loose soil there.
Yeah.
There's an incredible amount of erosion that resulted from this. And, of course, it's wildlife habitat. And they would crash over plants. Practically the whole town wanted to stop this. And so it did go on and on and on for quite a while. People came up with all sorts of proposals. How do we stop this? There was even one ORV club called the 4x4s that actually blocked the trails that other ORV drivers would use to get into the wilder country. Wow. Finally, there were fines imposed and things, so not happening right now. I hope it never does again.
Thankfully. I mean, the most we are currently allowing that I know of, because I haven't seen any motorized vehicles up there, thank goodness, are bicycles, but they're strictly limited to specific paths because of how damaging it can be. For instance, there are some certain bee species that live literally inches below the surface of the ground. And so when we think like, what's it hurting? It's just some plants and stuff. No, there's actually like populations underneath your feet that can extend for a few meters to just inches. You run through that stuff. You don't know what you're killing. Not to mention, I read an article many years ago about the decibel levels of off-road vehicles shattering eardrums of smaller mammalian species. So there's a lot of stuff that doesn't go real well with nature and loud vehicles, in my opinion. Before I forget, too, because I also have written down, can you speak on Horseshoe Lake? Because that's a big one I think everyone knows about. Or at least knows the lake in reference.
People know the lake. One of the things that people do not know about Horseshoe Lake is it's not a natural lake. It was actually constructed in the 1930s. Well, water was diverted. It was a WPA project. Water was diverted from Horseshoe Lake. Oh, no, I'm sorry, from Big Chico Creek to this area as a reservoir for the golf course. And for a while that continued. The golf course decided for different reasons that they would rather get their water directly from the creek. So Horseshoe Lake wound up going through a lot of different things. There was water skiing. If you can imagine that, people would water ski on Horseshoe Lake.
Paul and I had a in-depth conversation about what did that look like, because at this point, if anyone knows can reference the lake as it is now, maybe not post all of these storms that we've just had, but in the average of the past few years, how could that be possible? Just doesn't make sense.
I cannot imagine. And one thing I do want to mention again is it was the 70s, 80s, and beyond that there was a whole lot of discussion in the Park and Playground Commission around ecological issues and how this place should be preserved and how it should function.
Yeah.
And some of it was, I've been through the minutes, some of it was incredibly boring, other parts were like Shakespearean drama or something. If you want to read something pretty wild, pick up the minutes sometime.
Yeah, which I encourage everyone to do, on an occasion in their life. Sometimes the minutes, they're there as public record, and sometimes the things that are said just go right by people's eyes, and it's nice to know. Well, we're kind of nearing the end of the show very quickly here. The second show that we're going to have on this, the part 2, is going to be a bit more geared around why was this book, what's the import of this book, essentially? What were you kind of shooting for? So to kind of lead into that, 2 weeks from now, there'll be lots of advertising coming up, advertising meaning my Facebook posts and stuff like that, so do stay tuned. But in 2 weeks, you'll see Paul Belz again back on the show for a part 2 of this book. And again, the title of this book is Bidwell Park, Personal Reflections and Casual Conversations About Chico's Crown Jewel by Paul Belz. We will circle around and I'll let you guys know where to find and where to acquire this book and meet Paul in real life, in person, at Munka tomorrow, 7 o'clock. But can you talk a little bit about the native plants and animals that were kind of in the area?
You mean about the introduced plants?
Introduced plants,
okay.
Sorry, non-native. Yes.
The introduced plants have been a huge issue practically from day one. Part of the problem is the park is so close to people's yards that a lot of plants that are not indigenous to this part of California make their way into the park. One of the big ones is ivy. And ivy will climb up into the oaks, and it has to be removed because it can block photosynthesis in the crown of the oak. There are people who go out there regularly and remove ivy. It's hard work. I've done it, but it's a good thing to do. But there are tons of other introduced plants. Star thistle is one of the big ones.
Yeah, huge. Popinifera. I've lost a few bike tires to star thistle.
Oh, yeah.
And another one that I remember reading in the book was at some point, this was not recent as far as I know, but there was a booming population of cats in the park that were disturbing some of the bird species there.
Yeah, there were people who felt that feral cats should be allowed to live in the park, that people actually would feed them, take food out. What happened was a lot of people who didn't want their cats anymore would take them out and leave them in the park.
Yeah.
And so people would come and feed them. They did have a big impact on bird populations. Quail populations in particular went down. But there have been fines and restrictions on cats in the park. And you do find California quail in the park. Again, thank you.
They came back, thank goodness.
They came back.
Yeah. And then in the last couple minutes, too, the last thing I have written here is funding. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Funding has been an immense issue, practically from the beginning. Everyone who I talk to will tell you that, yes, the city will sing the praises of the park, but it does not get the money that it needs for maintenance, for ecological projects, or for anything else. So that's something that really needs to be concentrated on. How do we promote funding for the park? And there are a lot of ideas, some of which I mention in the book, but yeah.
Which we will get to a little bit more in depth in part 2 of this show, because that's a little bit more of the why. Mm-hmm. I think maybe, please correct me if I'm speaking out of turn on this, but in order for something to be worked on and focused on, it needs attention brought to it. And so this book, I believe, is Paul's attempt to say, hey, we should be talking about kind of this entire aspect of the park. Can you explain that a little bit?
Which aspect of the park?
Well, I guess I didn't really lead you into a great question there. Sorry, I lobbed and total swing and a miss there.
It's okay.
I guess let's give them a taste of what part 2 will be like. What was the point of this book?
The point of this book was to really promote the idea that a city can have a really positive and healthy relationship with open space around it. And this is really a great chance to do that. And there are a lot of wonderful things going on in the park. We'll get into them in more depth next time. There are educational programs going on. There are people who are really working on restoration and cleaning places up, people who do water quality testing. And I'll talk a little bit more next time about Peter Berg, who I used to know, who wrote and talked in depth about the relationship a community can have with the world around it. So we can get into that more next time.
Yeah. What we want to survive with us, we have to help survive.
Absolutely.
Is really how I've been looking at a lot of things in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, where can we find this book if you want to get a copy of it?
Okay, again, the bookstore, Made in Chico, Hidden Treasures, and Bidwell Supply, and the Chico History Museum has a couple too.
Thank you. And again, Paul, if you would like to meet him, get a copy of the book yourself. He'll be at Munka tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Thank you again, Paul, for coming on the show. This has been Writing on Air. If you'd like to comment or talk to me or be part of the show and you have some writing of any kind, it doesn't have to be a giant book. It can be some poems. Anything that you've done is writing. Please contact me at write.onair@gmail.com, write.onair. And right now, this was Writing on Air.